Today is June 29, 2009. This is the second session of your interview. We left off at our first session toward the end of the Cahill administration going into the 1973 campaign. We talked a little bit about that campaign. You mentioned that you were somewhat disappointed at the Democratic candidate for governor, Brendan Byrne, not taking a more forthright position on the income tax, but that you felt, at that time at least, that you weren't politically astute enough to sort of be a Monday morning quarterback as to whether that was right or wrong. But do you think that in 1973 the tax issue in New Jersey was so telling that Brendan Byrne could have lost that election against Charlie Sandman, given the fact that the polls showed him so far ahead?
That's a good question. I don't know that the tax issue was that strong that if he had come out somewhat more positive for an income tax that it would have hurt him that badly. And frankly, I didn't remember that I was that critical when we talked before. Because in hindsight, sitting here today, I don't know that I would say that. I remember feeling that maybe should have more articulate, but given the fact of how long it took us to get it done, probably just as well that it played itself out the way that it did.
Well, in that campaign, he said he didn't see the need for an income tax, quote, in the foreseeable future. Right. Whatever that meant. In truth, it would be fairly soon in the future when he would change his position on that. This morning we discussed with Steve Persky in his own campaign his reaction to that, and he felt a little bit disappointed and thought his political position in Atlantic County was somewhat undermined by candidate Byrne saying that. How about you? Did you have a milder reaction?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. There was no groundswell in Middlesex County for an income tax. Middle-class county, blue-collar county in a lot of ways, skepticism about statewide taxes in the past, what happened to the sales tax money, what happened to the lottery money, just a whole lot of undercurrent, a whole lot of suspicion, a whole lot of distrust by the electorate. So people weren't standing in line. I remember when on the Cahill tax in '72, I was the only one in our delegation no, I guess Tommy Devon. We abstained. We wanted to vote for it, but we felt that there was that business windfall. But nobody else was voting for it, and yet they weren't intellectually or dug in against it. But they weren't ready to take. They needed leadership, is what they needed to get out and work with, and they had to be programmed and packaged right.
I believe you said in our first session that Ed Crabiel was, I believe, the lone dissenter on the Blue Ribbon Tax Commission.
Yes, he was.
The Cahill years. Also had taken the position that the Cahill tax program and the Commission's recommendation was too skewed toward business interests and that there should be more balance.
That's right. That's why he talked about classification, so that you could tax business properties at 3-to-1 as compared to the residence properties. Whether that was just a holding position or whether that was something that he really wanted to do, I never had a chance. I suppose I had chances. I never asked Ed about it. In those days, fresh from the Assemblyman, you didn't go up and ask your senator, hey, why are you doing that? What's really behind your position?
So he didn't really try to exert influence within the rest of the Middlesex Democrats?
No. The only thing that I remember was the day that the Cahill tax went up, I had an amendment drawn that said that it wouldn't become effective until the classification amendment was approved on a referendum. And the next thing I knew, all three senators were standing back at the Assembly chambers waiting to see what was going to happen, because there was some support for what Ed's position had been. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure it was still his position, but it made a great deal of sense to me at the time.
Now, when he announced that he was going to become a candidate in the 1973 primary for governor, do you recall what position he was taking on future tax issues in the state?
There's a time I could have answered that. I can't. I can't now. I think he took the position that we had to do something. That we had to do something because of the school financing. That the property tax was onerous and burdensome. But I don't recall that he was way out front or articulating that the income tax was the way to go. I could probably go back and read something, but as I sit here today, I don't recall.
Once Brendan Byrne gets the nomination, did you campaign with him?
I was at locations with him, yes. He didn't need any help from a one-term assemblyman. We were enthusiastic about him as a candidate. I mean, you know, all the man who couldn't be bought, the background. He was an attractive candidate. He was not a seasoned candidate in any sense of the word, but he was somebody who felt good about running with. But I don't recall a whole lot of. Certainly, he didn't go door to door. He didn't do train stops, and that was a large part of the kind of campaigning we did in those early years.
When you say not seasoned, he wasn't articulate or forceful?
No, I mean, he came off the bench. He was a lawyer and a judge, and not a politician, which probably very attractive to a whole lot of people. Certainly, I wasn't a politician yet either, if I ever became one. But we felt good about him as a candidate. Just let me leave it there.
Beyond the tax issue, what other issues do you recall locally within your own campaign? This was a time when New Jersey was heading toward the depths of its economic recession, the loss of heavy industry. Locally in New Brunswick, I think there were rumors Johnson & Johnson might relocate outside the state because of the decline of the city. There were factories closing throughout the state. Were those major topics in that 73 campaign?
The economy was. I think really the reason why we did well here, and probably a part of the reason why we did so well statewide, was that there had been an economic recession, a Republican recession, on the heels of Watergate. People were ready to make a change, and I think the economy was a part of it. It's not as sharp in focus as it was a few years ago, but I would say there weren't really any lighthouse issues when we ran. We didn't have a laundry list of things that we wanted to do. We were concerned about property tax reform. We were concerned about senior citizens. But I don't recall that there was a series of bills that we felt we had to get through. And I think we kind of picked, as we got down there, we tried to support what we thought was good and picked out the things that we wanted to work on individually. That was certainly true in my case.
Going back to Johnson & Johnson, did you get any lobbying from them or indirect feeling that their continued presence in New Brunswick was at risk?
Never lobbied on it. I had heard at some point along the way that they came within one vote in the executive committee or the board of leaving New Brunswick. And certainly Route 18 was vitally important to them because it was going to give New Brunswick a shot in the arm. And of course, Ed Cravio was very supportive on that. John Lynch was very supportive on that. But I don't think I was ever lobbied. They had a gentle touch, small contributions in later years. I had some personal contacts with people over there who might talk to me, but never any heavy lobbying that I recall.
In fact, in that 1973 general election, Brendan Byrne was elected in a landslide. Democrats also in the legislature, with the advantage of the Byrne victory at the top of the ticket, sweep into strong majorities in both houses. What was your feeling on election night?
A measure of euphoria. I don't think, this is my second time out, I felt I was probably going to be okay this time. I think we all felt that Byrne was going to win. I don't think anybody envisioned we were going to take 66 seats out of 80 in the Assembly. And we knew we had work to do. We didn't know what all the work was or where we were going to go. We didn't know what kind of leadership we would get. We didn't know what roles we were going to play in terms of, backbencher, committee, or what have you. But we felt good about it.
Now that you mentioned the leadership, with all these newcomers in the Assembly, you're suddenly somewhat of a senior statesman with all these first-termers coming in. What did you feel personally as your own interests in leadership or committee positions?
I don't know why, looking back on it, that I felt this way, but I felt I wanted to try to move into leadership. I had, in the course of the campaign, I'd come out on 2 or 3 things and with releases and positions and shared it with everybody who was running, I guess improving my profile, if you will. And then we won so big, and it was pretty obvious that there was probably a small handful of people from which the leadership would come. Pretty obvious that Howard Woodson and Joe LaFonte would be playing major roles, and after that it was pretty much up for grabs.
How much, if any, did the new Byrne team play in trying to influence the leadership decisions?
I've never known for sure. The fact that I end up as being the assistant majority leader, if you will, in competition with people like Al Burstein, Herb Klein, and others, I have to think that Ed Crabeel must have said, "Hey, this kid's all right," or "This kid is maybe a comer." I don't know what he said, and I never asked him that either. But I have to think that Ed Crabeel was, in some measure, responsible for me being kind of anointed to the extent that the administration was trying to direct the leadership fight, and I think they did. It wasn't real obvious. Maybe it was through Joe Gannon, our executive director. Maybe it was in some other way, some of the senior people. But I don't recall any hard lobbying by the administration for anybody in the leadership team.
Of course, Ed Crabeel becomes Secretary of State.
Right.
At the beginning of the Byrne administration. And
in the State House, every day.
And at that point, was he the principal liaison from the administration to the legislature, or was it more uncertain as to who was the key administration contact?
Good question. I think he was very important, but he didn't do it himself. I recall his assistant or deputy secretary of state was a fellow by the name of Joe Carragher, had been a reporter with the Ledger, I think. And we saw a lot of Joe. We saw a lot of Joe Gannon, who was our own guy. But Ed was more distant. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but he wasn't a hands-on with respect to us, as I recall.
And of course, within the governor's office, you had Jerry English as the legislative counsel, Lou Caden as the special counsel. Was that somewhat confusing in terms of the roles and which turf was where? Very
much so, yeah. Well, of course, we knew Jerry because she had been elected to the Senate in November and had a 2 or 3 month head start on everybody else. But yeah, you didn't know who was really calling signals there. But fortunately, both able people.
And some have said that in those early, or maybe the first year, there were communication problems with the governor's office in terms of positions and the hierarchy of responsibility. Did you find that to be the case?
I think definitely so. There was, we were feeling our oats to a certain extent. We'd all been successful. We had a large majority, which was a problem in and of itself, our large majority. But whenever there was pressure being brought by the administration or to move in a certain direction or in a certain timetable, there was some resentment, pretty much throughout the delegation, I think. Certainly the people that I spoke to.
Yeah. As you've referred to it, and political scientists will say that sometimes the larger majorities are the most difficult to discipline.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any anecdotes or?
I guess time has taken the edge off of most of them, but there certainly were some. Nothing that I recall right now, but 66 of the. I can only say it this way: in the next election, after the Assembly had passed the governor's income tax, and the Senate rejected it, we lost 17 seats out of that 66 majority. Of those 17 that we lost, I always said there was only one that was because of the income tax vote, and that was Herb Klein, who'd been attacked mercilessly by his local newspaper until the Saturday before the election when they endorsed him. But most of the other people, it was a case of a district returning to normal. It didn't have Watergate. It didn't have the negative of a Charlie Sandman. It didn't have Brendan at the top of the ticket. So that I never felt it was a repudiation of what we'd done. I think maybe a lot of people did. I never felt it was a repudiation of trying to pass a progressive tax. I think it was districts returning to normal.
Going back to those early months of the Byrne first year, he starts strongly, implements the odd-even gas plan, which received a lot of positive national publicity dealing with the Arab oil boycott. What's your recollection of those first years, or first months rather, in office?
Well, I can remember being at the leadership breakfast meetings at Morven, where it seemed we talked and talked and talked and talked. And whatever direction it was really came from the front office, from the governor. There wasn't anything coming from the legislative leaders. There was frequently some foot dragging. You had, as I recall, Pat Dodd was the Senate president. He was never in lockstep with the front office. He was dragging his feet on things like taxes. Pretty much everything else has faded into my memory as far as some of those other issues. But it was a growing process between the executive and the legislature, and there were hard feelings. There were not so much for the governor, but for his people, who seemed to want to tell us what we should do, what we had to do, and after all, we were the ones who'd gotten elected. And I don't know that I had very strong feelings like that. I had some of those feelings, but there were a lot of people who did have very strong feelings.
Do you recall how you first learned that the Byrne administration was now going to come out forthrightly for an income tax?
No, I remember there was a meeting, and I don't remember where it was held, at which Brendan came and talked to us, and it became clear they were moving in that direction. And I don't remember the timeline, but no, there was really only one sensible way to go. As far as I didn't need any intellectual prodding to figure that out, and I think a lot of other people felt, not everybody, but a lot of people felt. A lot of people were afraid, just plain afraid of a tax of any kind. If it had been a statewide property tax, you would have had some of the same. But income tax was totally brand new, so there was a lot of concern about that.
We'll talk about some of those alternatives. You mentioned the statewide property tax was one idea that was advanced as a possible alternative to an income tax, or possibly a combination of the two. Others felt that a package of smaller taxes might get the state through at least the short-term problem. What were the other options that people were talking about?
Well, some people talked about the sales tax, which to me didn't make any sense at all. They did talk about varieties of statewide property tax. There were varieties of income taxes. There was I hope I'm not getting Byrne and Cahill confused now, but some people wanted to do a pure New York type tax, much higher numbers. That was certainly Cahill trying to pay, I guess, 100% of education. So a whole lot of stewing around as to what way to go and what was best, and how to package it, which ultimately I felt was going to be very important. How it was packaged, how it was sold. Now,
the Cahill tax proposal, as I understand it, was more of a tax with deductions, more akin to the federal income tax. The eventual Byrne income tax was a gross income tax. Did you feel strongly either way?
Well, since I carried the, the ultimate tax, I guess I did. I thought simplicity was important. I thought getting rid of some of those deductions probably made sense. But the Byrne tax in 1974 was more like the Cahill tax, but it was scaled down and had the circuit breaker in it to give some extra property tax relief for people in those categories.
In 74, what were the political calculations in terms of what votes you needed? Were there key people that you were targeting on both sides of the aisle?
Well, I don't think we were as sensitive to the need to get some Republican votes as we became later on.
Was that because of the strong Democratic majorities?
Probably so, and because we were still green as far as the leadership game was concerned. We knew it was going to be tough, and we had ambivalent feelings about the governor's office. You wanted them to go get guys to vote yes when you wanted them to do that, and you wanted them to leave you alone the rest of the time and do it on your own. And I don't know that we were always consistent on that, but that's the way I recall it. No, there was, as I say, the leadership team was a good team, but I think it was still green in terms of having an overall strategy. We didn't have that. We weren't conscious of trying to make it somewhat bipartisan. We're just trying to get it done.
Were your strategic calculations based on mostly individual votes, or were there people you thought, well, if we can get his vote, 3 others will follow?
I don't recall that. May have been, but that's in the quarter century ago. Now, more than a third of a century now.
How about some of the people who had, particularly Republicans, who had voted for the Cahill tax, but now were either sort of hedging their bets, or you thought, possibly could be swung? Were there negotiations along those lines?
I wasn't party to them if there were. We undoubtedly had some conversations, but no heavy-duty efforts. I don't remember now when we got our 41 votes whether there were any Republicans in there. I'm inclined to think that there were not. There were some very progressive people on the other side. The former speaker, the now minority leader, Tom Kean, an obvious one. Fellows that later voted for our tax, Carl Weidel, Bobby Lytle. But I don't think we went after them with any. I think maybe left that to the administration, maybe left it to on the staff side. I am sure that Joe Gannon was exploring everything he could, and if he thought that there had been some Republicans who might be prepared to come over, what would it take to get their vote? But I have no clear recollection now.
Well, what about Tom Kean's personal position? He had supported the Cahill tax program. Obviously, as a former speaker and minority leader now in the new legislature, his vote would obviously have been a major victory for your side. But you don't recall any specific...
I don't recall any efforts made, and I'm not sure that he would have brought very many people with him. He would have made it legitimate to go that way, but I'm not sure his conference would have. Given what happened a couple of years later, his conference was ready to depose him as minority leader for having supported the tax that we put up.
And would part of that calculation, and I know this is conjecture or speculation rather, been the fact that the Republicans had turned to Charlie Sandman in the 73 election as their gubernatorial nominee, showing the strength of the conservative wing of the party, and maybe that had chilled some of the more moderate Republicans in the legislature?
The Republican Party always turns right in the primary. They have a death wish. We probably turn too far the other way, but they turn right and sometimes pay for it.
In '74, you've mentioned that the leadership was a little bit green and that it was difficult to control the supermajority that you had in the Assembly. Any other mistakes? You mentioned the Byrne administration being a little bit confusing as to who was in charge.
Oh, there were probably mistakes made all the time, but nothing I recall jumping out at me at this point in time. But
well, after that first defeat, what discussions did you have within the legislature and the Assembly in particular in terms of the next steps?
Well, after they finally got the governor's tax to a vote in the Senate, and it was defeated, the governor sent in a line item veto for the budget that had just been adopted and cut out $384 million worth of spending to keep the budget constitutionally balanced. And the leadership definitely had to sit down and decide how were we going to cope with that. Were we going to live with the cuts? Whether we were going to try to put together some nuisance taxes to restore some or all of it. And I don't recall all the give and take on it, but in the long run, we just felt that we couldn't live with all those cuts, that we had to restore some of them, and we went to work on it. And we decided to do it with as much political astuteness as we could, and decided to go out on the road. We had a hearing in Montclair, we had a hearing in Camden, we had a hearing in Trenton, to listen to how the people felt. I mean, I think we initially felt that you had to restore some of this. But if the people said, let's live with all the cuts, I think we would have followed suit. But we went out, and of course, predictably, you get all stripes of opinion on it, and came back and cobbled together a whole bunch of nuisance taxes, including an unearned income tax, which we got through as a part of that package, later repealed when we did the real thing. But it was an interesting summer. It was a long, hot summer. And we finally, I don't know the full amount of the restoration, but it was a major part of the $384 million. I would say somewhere down in 320 or 330. I remember issues about local health aid and some things like that, but kind of the details have faded, but I remember they were significant things in putting that package together. It was probably tax on wine and beer, and increase the realty transfer fee and things of that kind.
Well, largely because of the adverse reaction to the first income tax proposal by the Byrne administration, his popularity really plummets toward the end of that first year. Was there talk within the legislature that, well, you know, given these problems, we have to go off on our own a little bit and show some distance from the administration?
I don't think it was exactly that way. I think there was a feeling that at least some of the staff in the governor's office were out of touch, and that we were going to have to try to do it our way, not distancing ourselves. It wasn't the idea of distancing, but that it was in our lap, and we were the ones that were going to have to cobble something. That was, of course, after the election results, and that's what we ultimately did. But I don't think it was really anti-administration. It was, they're not going to be much help. We've got to look to ourselves to do it, and that we're going to go ahead and do it.
You mentioned that there was some feeling that maybe the governor's office, or at least some of the key people there, were out of touch. Was part of that a cultural divide between the people who were now key Byrne people, including the governor, a Harvard, Princeton product, as well as his treasurer, Dick Leone, a Princeton product, Lou Caden, a Harvard Law School product. Was that part of the feeling that there was an arrogance, or that these people were not our people from the legislator's viewpoint? I
would say this, thinking back on it. I don't think it was a cultural divide, but you used the word arrogant. I do think there was a feeling there was some arrogance in some of these people who'd never been elected to anything, and they were working for the governor. It wasn't really aimed at the governor. It was aimed at his minions, if you will, the messengers that he sent. And I think there was some feeling about that. But it was more a feeling, hey, we got to look to ourselves to get it done. We can't look to them to do it.
Of course, one of those key people, Lou Caden, was tacitly a Middlesex County, quote, resident,
Yes.
quote, from Perth Amboy. What relationship did you have with him? And any
Never met him until got down there, and reasonably cordial relationship, and there was no warmth in that relationship. It was
even though he had run for office in Middlesex County.
Yeah, I think he did run for Congress at one point in time. What year was that?
Ed Patton, I think
Yeah, but okay, that's right. Which probably didn't help either, because Ed Patton was a saint, if you will. He much beloved, and here's somebody who wants to unseat him, and now he's working for the governor. You refresh me with respect to that.
So even though he had run politically as a Democratic candidate for Congress, you had no contact with him?
None at all. As I say, met him as a part of the Byrne administration.
Now, how about the other key figures? Dick Coffey, who initially was a gubernatorial candidate against Brendan Byrne and then folded his tent to back the Byrne candidacy and became the campaign chairman. How about your relationship with him?
I think that Dick Coffey, like Ed Krabiel, had a great deal of credibility with the legislators. Probably felt closer to Dick because he was younger and more outgoing. And I'm not sure about the time frame we're talking about because he came in later. But he was a different personality from Ed. But both of them were obviously politicians who had proven their mettle, who had been through the wars, and I think there was a lot of respect for both.
How about some recollections of a few of the other people at that time, Joe LaFonte, others who you dealt with?
Joe was just a solid guy. Joe. What year? We're still in 74, 75.
Right.
Joe was a good majority leader. He wasn't a particularly intellectual guy, but he was. He had a touch for people and knew people, and you knew he was tough and strong and as independent, I guess, as he could be in that Hudson milieu or that Hudson delegation. I was his assistant, and I trying to be as helpful as I can to, and he was a good guy to work with. The rest of our team was George Barber, an old hand who was very, very solid. Herb Klein was the conference chairman. Herb wasn't as smooth, I guess, as Betty Wilson was a whip. Kenny Gewirtz was a whip. Betty was a team player all the way. Kenny was, you didn't know where Kenny was going.
We'll talk a little bit more about Kenny. We've heard a few stories.
And there are many.
Well, any of the colorful ones we've not heard, like the one in Atlantic City
with the watch?
With the watch and hookers.
Well, Kenny would come in with some flamboyant attire, and occasionally with some flamboyant ladies, and cut a wide swath. And when whatever happened in Atlantic City, I like to remember the way that Dick Hughes later told it from the dais. It said there was a misunderstanding about Kenny and the watch being stolen. Just that he'd been down there with these ladies, and he turned to two others and said, "Do you want to watch?" And they took it literally. I will tell you that at one of our last legislative reunions, Kenny came, and he was as mellow as you could be. He died a couple of years after that, but he was very mellow, so happy to be a part of it. And when all said and done, he was a good guy. I think he took himself pretty seriously. When he first came down, his district mate was Senator Jim Turner. And I didn't know Jim Turner that well, but Jim Turner had gotten arrested for carrying a gun and was knocked out of the chairmanship of the Joint Appropriations Committee. And he and Kenny must have been like characters from opposite parties, and they really went at one another. But Kenny switched sides, and Kenny Kenny would be very, very critical of Jimmy Dugan, the state chairman, and supportive of Brendan Byrne, and then a month later it would be the other way around. He couldn't stand Brendan, and he was Jimmy Dugan's buddy. So you never quite knew what Kenny was on, and I don't mean to suggest he was on anything because I don't think he was, but he was a changeable guy.
In that tax fight, you had some people who I'm still rolling.
I'm not crying, but my eyes do water a lot.
What's that? In that tax fight, you had some people pushing on the left for a more extensive revenue package. Harold Martin, I think, was one.
Could have been.
How did you deal with that? I guess it's just basically trying to figure out where the balance is in terms of the votes.
Well, if we're still in 74, 75, we were dealing with the governor's package, and we weren't going to fine-tune that very much. It was about the right size. It was going to do the job, and I don't recall that we did a lot. Some of the accompanying bills that might have gone along with it, I think Steve Persky, who you talked to this morning, was pushing for some business tax relief. 2 years before, we'd felt that the problem was there was too much business tax relief. But the bill was not tinkered with very much. And the companion bills, I don't recall being, may have been one or two that was discarded, but basically we're putting the package through.
Well, talk about the key figures in putting together the legislature's own proposal after the first Byrne initiatives failed.
After we lost our 17 seats,
right.
We met on a February morning in my law office in New Brunswick with the leadership and Dick Van Wagner, who was chairman of the tax committee, Charlie Yates, who was chairman of the Joint Appropriations Committee. I don't recall whether Willie Brown was there or not. He was the vice chair of one of those. And we talked. We talked extensively, and I really didn't decide anything except, I guess, a couple of principles. We decided that there had to be some Republican support for whatever we did. And there had to be a large measure of property tax relief in some kind. It couldn't just be an add-on tax. We talked about, it wasn't called a homestead then, but whatever we were calling it at that point in time.
Circuit breaker.
I don't think it was circuit breaker. It was because circuit breaker, you never got the money. We jokingly said that we were going to have this method, and the checks were going to be picked up on the Saturday morning before the general election at the assemblyman's office. Now, we didn't literally mean that, but it was a way.
It really came to pass.
Yeah, it was a way of expressing that there had to be some real tangible property tax relief that people could see and feel, and it wasn't some theoretical thing. It was tangible, and I remember after that meeting, I ended up in what had been Al Cooper's saloon, the After Five, and I was with Bob Smart and the late Stan Van Ness, and I had already started working on what became the homestead, and I was bouncing some numbers, and Stanley was very helpful in terms of what would be the rate. I think we started out with $250 plus a quarter of the effective tax rate to recognize the difference from town to town. And they were going off to either a hockey game or basketball game in New York, and I wasn't going. But I remember we had a drink or two and we talked about it, and then we went back to work in Trenton. One of the things we decided was we were not going to get out there talking about we're pushing this, we're pushing that. We're studying it, and the late Herb Rosen was our PR guy. Anytime we talk about it, well, we're looking at all the alternatives. We're talking about a statewide property tax. We're talking about a sales tax. We're talking about an income tax, and we haven't decided yet. And because we didn't want anybody out shooting at anything too early, while we try to frame it. I went before the tax committee and came up with some of these ideas. I put the bills in on my own, and put a couple of varieties of income tax in, and put a referendum in. And I remember one of the Trenton papers came out and talked about what a great package it was, except I was nuts to talk about a referendum, which is what we had in the long run, even though it wasn't one that we put together, it was one that Billy Musto gave us. But that process took months. We had a fellow from the nonpartisan legislative staff by the name of Gil Deardorff, who was doing the work for us, and just did some magnificent work in terms of generating numbers and putting things together. And we finally put a package together and put it up for a vote.
One part of that package was also the caps on spending at all government levels in New Jersey. How did that come to pass?
That had been something that John Russo and John Doyle and Danny Newman, I think, had put together, and we passed it, if memory serves me, prior November, before the election, so that now I may be wrong on that. We had passed Chapter 212. We'd passed the thorough and efficient, which was the educational component. And I'm not sure that we had already passed the caps, but the caps weren't going to have any trouble getting votes for the caps. You might have trouble fine-tuning it, but you weren't going to have trouble getting votes for it. So that was going to be the control on spending was also a part of this, besides the property tax relief, that couldn't just be an invitation to spend more by Trenton.
And I recall, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Chapter 212 went up to the Supreme Court and was approved by the court if it were funded before the actual revenue package was approved, or am I wrong?
I think you're right that, well, when the governor's package went up, we didn't have the educational component because we were back in court all the time. Of course, the Assembly by then had passed an income tax, and as far as the court was concerned, I guess we were the fair-haired boys, and the Senate hadn't done anything yet, and our lawyers wouldn't say we were waiting for the Senate to act, and that worked until, but eventually we had to get beyond that. We got I think you're right in saying that the Chapter 212 was out of the way. It had been, an imprimatur had been put on it by the time we put the tax package together.
I guess my notes show that the Republicans picked up 17 seats in 75.
That's right. Went from 66 to 49.
Now, by losing all those Democrats who probably were there just by the accident of the 73 landslide, did that make it easier in terms of discipline and trying to get the votes for the final package that did pass?
In some ways. I mean, you knew that you were the survivors, and fellows who were more assured of being around for a while because they were in a district that they could win. But sometimes there was some luxury in that 66 number to be able to pick people up from time to time. But overall, I remember saying when we came back that we wouldn't be as liberal, we would be more responsible, and that we could do it with the reduced numbers. I felt that, and it proved to be so.
We'll talk about those final days leading to the tax votes, both in the Assembly and the Senate.
Wow.
Who were the key people that you still needed to bring on? What were the issues that were coming up? Or what deals were being struck?
Well, I guess the most important non-deal, we had, Joe LaFonte and I had stayed in touch with Tom Kean, and we told him we were hoping to have some support. To his credit, he said, he was listening. He wanted, and we gave him a vote on basic skills, as I recall it, that there would be some testing, and we put that bill through. We felt it was absolutely imperative to have some Republican votes. When we put the vote up, we had no assurance, we had no guarantee from Kean that he would vote for it or that anybody in his conference would. But he did tell us that they weren't going to take a party line position against the tax. And they frequently did on things like taxes, and I guess we had taken party positions against it too. So that we ended up with 5 votes on the other side. I don't remember how sure we were of any of them. I think we had some hope for Tony Verlaine, because he had come down with a reputation as a moderate. I guess we were hoping for Moose Ferrand. We got him. Carl Weidel. Too much time has gone by, I can't remember. I mean, these were wonderful guys who supported us, and Bobby Lytle. Lytle was an interesting case in that his senator was Wayne Dumont. Wayne Dumont was an institution on the other side. Virulently anti-tax, very, very strong and powerful as far as education was concerned. Represented a whole bunch of school districts up in Warren County. And I remember sharing a platform with he and the late Ann Martindale at the YWCA in New Brunswick when the second casino bill was going through. And Dumont said, and when I stand here tonight and tell you that I'm in favor of the voting yes for the casino voting, I don't want you to think I'm in favor of the income tax, because I've been against the income tax for 20 years, and I'll always be against the income tax. And 6 months later, when he saw how essential it was for education and for his school districts, he was out there leading the charge. And most mornings when I'd leave the house, I'd get a call from him. What do you want me to talk to Lytle about today? Who do you want me to talk to? He became a whip for us, which is one of the nice things that I remember about all of that. But when the first vote went up, when we passed 43 to 37 or 38, we weren't sure we were going to get any of their votes. Kane was as good as his word. He didn't promise it. He voted for it, and people went along with him. And over, as I now know, considerable animosity in his own conference. I've heard stories that there was almost a vote to unseat him. John Dorsey was very strongly against it. Frank McDermott was angry, and I think Kane showed his good side of what's best for the state. If you think it's the right thing, do it. If you don't, don't vote for it. He certainly wasn't trying to sell anybody on our position, but took a hands-off approach, and for that first vote, it worked.
Of course,
now we packaged it up pretty good with the homestead and with some other bills that went in there, but the centerpiece, of course, was the tax bill.
Well, you mentioned the homestead in your somewhat joking reference to having the checks at the assembly or legislators' offices for distribution. In fact, the administration does provide for a homestead rebate check being sent directly to taxpayers, which eventually went out with the governor's signature.
Right.
How much of that discussion did you have with the administration in terms of how taxpayers would be directly informed of the benefit they were getting?
I don't know that we talked to them about it very much. That was their job to get it done. When we would try to sell the package, whether it was on the floor or out on the hustings, we talked about the feeling that it had to be tangible and real, and it would be, because they were going to get a check. We didn't say how we were going to get a check, but they were going to get a check. Going to get some money back, so that they couldn't say what happened to the lottery money, what happened to the sales tax money. It was going to be tangible. And the way I think we kind of chuckled when we first saw it was going out with Brendan's signature on it. But hey, that was in accord with what we'd said. It was going to be tangible.
In fact, as part of this project, we found in the State Archives memos between John Leza, who was then the Director of Local Government Services in the Department of Community Affairs, with Cliff Goldman, who was the Deputy Treasurer, in which Cliff forwards John's reservations about sending a check in terms of the costs and the administrative difficulty of doing it that way, with a short little note from Treasurer Leone back to Cliff saying it is critical that checks be sent out directly to taxpayers.
Well, I think he's probably right. When they're being cut, the homestead is now vital to everybody. When they're not talking about that, it's too expensive a way to do it, depending upon which critic you're reading, which newspaper you're reading. My recollection at the time we did it was that it was going to cost 1% of the total take. And I used to use that and say, I don't know of any other state programs that run on a 1% basis. I mean, to me, it's a pretty efficient program to do it, because there was always people, well, take it off the tax return, send it to your collector or whatever. I think the way it was done, large element of politics, and it was still the right thing to do.
Well, in fact, the tax passes only after the Supreme Court issues its order closing the schools on July 1st in the summer, but still closing the schools.
Yeah, the final vote did. Oh.
How crucial was that decision toward getting the final votes?
I'm not. For those who believed, you didn't need that. For those who didn't believe, you had to find some way to get them to believe. After we passed the tax, the Senate sat and stewed on it for quite a while. I don't know how much you remember, but they sent us back a 1% gross tax, which we put up, and it got 3 votes, and sent it back to them. And whereas we had been the House that had been acting and being effective in getting something done in the past, then it went back to the Senate. The Senate sent us a bill, and we couldn't get it back together. People were all over the lot on it, and as I might have said earlier when we were having lunch, we were back buying our supporters back again. People who've been with us all the way along. Now we had to give them something to be voting for us, and what they already had indicated they believed in. It was a very difficult time. I'm not sure that the closing, because the closing of school, it was summertime, and it was very little that was actually affected. I remember there was a couple of school bands were going to a 4th of July affair down in Philadelphia that they couldn't go to because of this, and we were in session constantly and fine-tuning the homestead and fine-tuning this and whatnot. We just had to get back to 41. I mean, that's still the name of the game. By that point in time, we had lost Kane, we had lost Ferran, we had lost Mullane. I guess they just had too much flack at home after they had voted for an unpopular tax. And they had done what they thought was the right thing, but they were only going to take so much heat for it and not do the Democrats' work. To their credit, Lytle and Wydell stayed with us all the way. Lytle was probably afraid to get off because of Wayne Dumont, but he believed. We had to you talked about deals. He wanted a vote on an anti-fluoridation referendum. Fluoridation in the water. It had nothing to do with taxes at all, but that was what he wanted, and he insisted on it. And we gave it to him. I gave it to him 3 times. I remember the last time I said, Bobby, this is it. If you can't get your votes this time, this is all. We've paid enough. But he stayed the whole way. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the Senate's reluctance after the Assembly had
Yes.
passed income taxes. Who were the key people there? You referred to Jim Dugan before. What was his role?
Well, he was state chairman, and I may have been in the Senate conference room once or twice before I was elected to the Senate, so I don't know what went on in there. Pat Dodd was never enthusiastic. Matty Feldman was. Matty was the majority leader. He was enthusiastic about the tax. I remember, I think Herb Bueller, who was a 1 or 2 termer from down in Monmouth County, supported it. If I got my timeline right, Ray Garamone up in Bergen was a supporter of it. But
and I think John Russo, who was initially a statewide property tax advocate,
yes.
Finally came.
Oh, he came over because his two running mates, Doyle and Newman, had supported it. It was interesting the whole time that we would have these leadership meetings and trying to formulate it. I remember the Howard Johnsons out there on US 1 would go there and have breakfast there, and we're kind of going around, and Doyle would still be talking about a statewide property tax. And one of the last leadership meetings we settled it was we were going to be public with the fact it was going to be an income tax with all the goodies that went with it. And Doyle said, I never committed to that. And Joe LaFonte looked at him and said, "What do you think we've been talking about for the last 4 months?" And that was just the way Joe was. He was just very direct. And John was on board, and he was great, and he was articulate. But I remember that funny incident.
Of course, even though you had lost a lot of the Democrats elected in the '73 landslide, you still had Democrats like the Doyle, Newman Russo team and Steve Persky in Atlanta County,
he was the
who were
zealot,
in
sure.
districts that were very vulnerable politically.
Yes. But Steve was a believer he was on board with governor's tax, carried the governor's tax, as I recall it. He sponsored it.
Mm-hmm. But these people still were risking their legislative careers by voting for the tax.
Yeah, sure. But you know what? You're not elected to have a legislative career. You're elected to do the people's business. Yeah. Maybe that's corny, but I always felt that way.
Well, now that the tax does get passed and signed by the governor, he still is very unpopular in terms of the...
I've still got one bone to pick with him.
Okay, what's that?
We finished that thing up, I don't know, probably at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at noontime. After about 8 days, I hadn't been home in about 4 days. I went upstairs and fell asleep in the majority leader's office, and I don't know where Joe was. Either called home or went home and found out that the governor was going to sign the bill that night. Never did check with... Joe LaFonte and I were not at the bill signing. Al Burstein. I just remember that, and Matty Feldman were. But
where was the bill signed?
I'm sure it must have been in either State House or in Morven. Probably in the State House.
Because there is a picture that we have of you and Madeline Rumowitz, I think, on the floor looking up at the board, I believe, when the...
No, that would have been either 74 or it could have been 76.
So it was not the final...
No, the final, we really didn't talk about that. When a bill came back from the Senate, the thing that finally put it across, remember I jokingly, I said that I got some heat for putting a bill in and say, after it's been in effect for a year, we'll have a referendum. And I never moved that bill. That's what Billy Musto put on the bill. He amended the bill to say it would self-destruct after 1 year. Okay, which that's fair enough. You know, if we passed it, we've done what we think is right. The public doesn't like it. That's what democracy is all about, after all. So now we go. Brendan runs for re-election. Ray Bateman runs against him. Brendan wins big. Came back, and with no fanfare at all in late December, the self-destruct was amended out of the bill, and we have the income tax on a permanent basis.
As that re-election campaign for Governor Byrne gets started, what was your thinking on his chances?
Well, I remember all the stuff about one-term Byrne and all the rest, but hey, I was with him. I didn't need any convincing. I thought he had done the right thing. I thought we had done the right thing. I thought there were a lot of other progressive things that had been done in terms of the environment and economic development and what have you. And that, hey, if you get run out of office for doing the people's business and doing it in what you think is a responsible way, then that's what it's all about. And Brennan, I don't think was ever known as a tough campaigner, but I know, having seen him on the tennis court, when his pride is on the line, he's a tough guy. And he was tough in that campaign. Ray was weak. Ray was not feeling well. And I frequently say that Ray Bateman lost that election in June of the prior year, when the Assembly bill went up in the Senate. Ray said, put it off until Monday. Let us go home. And he went home, probably caught a lot of heat on it, came back, and the bill lost. And Ray voted no. And Ray was a very progressive guy. He'd voted for taxes in the past, and I think that's when he lost that campaign. He didn't do, I think, what he thought was the right thing to do, which was get a progressive, fair income tax in place.
When we interviewed Ray for this series, he said that he knew he lost when he came back from a long day of campaigning, opened his mail, and his homestead rebate check was in And he said, I don't know if it's true, he then started writing his concession speech.
He started what? Really?
Yeah.
If he said it, it's probably true.
Well, before the general election, Brendan Byrne has the fortunate circumstance of looking so weak that he attracts so many challengers to his renomination as the Democratic candidate that it splits the anti-Byrne vote. Did any of those challengers ever approach you about possibly deserting the Byrne ship?
Bob Rowe called me, not about, but he wanted to talk about taxes, and because he knew he had to address it, and he was not particularly in favor of tax. One of the things that I've been talking about was a tax convention, and I forgot what the other was, but he joked, and I said, Bob, look, you can do one or you can do the other, but you can't do them both. And for the life of me, I can't remember what the second was now. He came out and he supported both, and I think didn't have any credibility. I mean, the governor's position was straightforward. You know, this is what we did. Is you love it or don't, but here it is.
Was he suggesting a referendum in addition to a convention?
Yeah, that's what it was, a referendum or a convention. He wanted to do both. Come on.
Mm-hmm. You know. Well, after the primary, and Bateman and Byrne are nominated by their respective parties, there's, of course, the famous Bateman-Simon plan that Brendan Byrne said would be referred to by its initials.
Right. So did everybody else within a day or so of the time that it surfaced.
Were you or other members of the legislature involved in how the Byrne administration should respond to the Bateman-Simon plan?
No, they didn't need us for that.
Did you feel that was the critical swing in the election in terms of public and sort of media sentiment and coverage of the campaign?
Well, probably in hindsight, but you know, no matter what they're saying in July, you got to get to November, and it's how the vote comes out on second Tuesday in November.
How was Byrne as a campaigner in '77 compared to '73?
Well, much more sure-footed, much more, still low-key, but he was running not with, you know, what kind of a person I am, running it with a record of accomplishment, with some failures, the record of accomplishment that had not been easy. I mean, anybody who watched any of that stuff on television knew that what we got done was not easy. They saw people sweating and working and day after day and all the rest, and they knew that's what the governor was doing, is trying to get things done. And he had a much broader agenda out there that had been successful on than just the taxes. I mean, I think the taxes was crucial, but a lot of other things in terms of the environment and economic development and education. You know.
And one of the issues we talked about a little bit earlier was Route 18 into New Brunswick and keeping Johnson & Johnson's world headquarters here.
Right.
Do you recall that coming up in your campaign in '77?
No, it was in the campaign of '71 when we ran the first time. My running mate and I supported Route 18. There were some people who, our opponents, were against Route 18. They didn't like it because there were some people who, there's always going to be people against things, and they tied onto that, and we said we were for it. And I just wanted to see it happen after that. I don't recall that being a major concern.
Of course, as I recall, I believe it was when David Goldberg was Transportation Commissioner, the initial cement pilings for the bridge were laid without any permits, illegally.
We used to say, I hope this is not family entertainment, Ed Craven's last erections.
But you do recall that?
Oh yeah, certainly do.
Sort of somewhat of a Robert Moses type step in New Jersey, I guess.
Well, I don't know whether we ever talked about that campaign that I ran with my running mate, who had the idea that we would walk across the Raritan to prove how absurd the Coast Guard's position was, that it was navigable up there, and we did. And I think we talked about that in the earlier session.
1977 election day and election night, what was your sort of emotional reaction?
Well, happy, very, very happy. We'd put together a bunch of, my routine was always the same. I would go close out my poll, 6-5 in New Brunswick. I would go to City Hall where votes were being counted, and then I would frequently go across the street to the county building to see how things were going. We went from there to the Elks. We had a little party at the Elks. And we also wanted to be a part of Brendan's celebration. So we got a bus, and we kind of gathered everybody at the Elks, and we jumped on a bus, and we'd heard that the governor's party was the Town and Country, and he'd gone home already. So we got on the bus, and we drove south on 27. As we're going through New Brunswick, Pat Sheehan, the Commissioner of Community Affairs, was on a bus with us, and she didn't have anything to drink. We were loaded up with beer and vodka and orange juice, so we could have refreshments. We had to stop at one of the bars along French Street to get Pat some white wine. We keep on going. We went down into Franklin Township, and there's a place there, Charlie Brown's. By that time, all the guys had to go to the men's room. So we had the bus stop. We pour out of the bus and go running into the men's room, coming out and stopping at the bar and buying drinks, getting back on the bus, and one of the assistant managers says, "You can't," people are walking out with a glass in their hands, "You can't take those things." The manager comes along and says, "Just get them out of here, let them go." We trundle on down the rest of 27 and pull into Morven, and 6 state troopers sitting there with in their shirt sleeves, and their can of beer in their hands. And we ran into the men's room again, and out came Mrs. Byrne and said the governor was upstairs. He had some warm milk and he'd gone to bed. So we got back in the bus, went back to New Brunswick, and we wrote it off as the bus trip to nowhere. But it was a very, very happy ride.
I guess we skipped over a little bit that you were elected speaker in '77.
Yeah, December '76.
When Joe LaFonte gets elected
to Congress. Yes.
Talk about that leadership promotion.
Well, I thought it was logical. I'd been the majority leader and had gotten us through some tough times, but not everybody else thought that way. I drew three opponents. Christy Jackman from Essex County, Ronnie Owens from from Hudson, Ronnie Owens from Essex, and my own Tommy Devern from Middlesex. I never did go back into how all of that came about, but I know that I was not quite midterm in my legislative career. I had never missed a session except in December of '76. I was on the executive committee of the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it was a trip to Israel. I was invited to go on it, and I decided I was going to go, so I missed one session. Before I went, I'd gotten the other 3 candidates together, and I said, look, we shouldn't have any monkey business doing anything with Republicans. Let's agree here and now that whoever gets a majority of the Democratic votes is going to be the speaker. And everybody signed off on that. I went off to Israel. I missed my one session. I came back, and I don't know whether I started making my phone calls before I left, before I didn't. But we had 49 people in the delegation, and I had a commitment from 25 of them, which is a majority. So we go into the first ballot, and I got 20 votes, and each of the other guys got either 5 or 7 votes. I've always said that I conclude from that, if you can generalize from the particular, that of any given sample, 20% of the people will screw you. And then there's this long delay before we have another vote. I don't even remember who was running the meeting, but maybe an hour or so. And I didn't know what was going on. It was obvious which way it was going to turn out. Well, we call a vote. Tommy Devern drops out. Christy Jackman drops out. Ronnie Owens stays in, and I beat Ronnie by some wide margin. What was happening, they were setting up the vote for majority leader, because Al Burstein was the fair-haired boy going to be my majority leader. But he went up against Christy Jackman, and Christy beat him.
Did you feel there was any behind-the-scenes meddling from the Byrne administration?
On that, no. Could have been. You can tell me if it was. I never felt that. I mean, I can't see how you would not want Al Burstein. And I think the guys coming out against me were just, some of it may have been to get ready on the majority leader vote, but I depending on who you talk to and when you talk to them, my reputation was, I was too partisan for the Republicans when I was voted in. I got no Republican votes to be Speaker. No, they didn't put anybody else up, but I got no Republican votes to be Speaker. 3 weeks later, they're coming up and telling me how fair I'm being to them. So you're either too partisan or not partisan enough, and my own guys thought I wasn't tough enough. They thought I was too tough. Who knows?
Of course, it also, in the year or so before this, there had been a major split in the Hudson Democrats. And,
oh, yes.
Did that have any factor in the Jackman election over Burstein?
Not that I know of. I always wondered if there was some anti-Semitism, and I hope not. But I have personal ambitions of people and making some deals.
Of course, also by this time, the Byrne-Dugan split politically had occurred. I guess partly because of legislative issues, but also because of presidential differences as to who to support nationally. What was your take on that, or was it something you were just observing from afar?
I was a part of that great body of people who were uncommitted for, what was it? Uncommitted for Brown or something like that. No, not uncommitted. That was Franny Gorman, who was for Jerry Brown. We were uncommitted, and we weren't going with Jimmy Carter. We were. My one day as a national committee man and whatever it was, or delegate, I guess, and not what it's cracked up to be.
Of course, Byrne was for Carter.
Yes.
But Dugan was leading the delegation.
Away, leading, just vote no, You reminded me of things I haven't thought about in years.
Well, this one you probably remember. You ran for the Senate that year.
Yes.
77, after being Speaker. Was that an easy choice? I mean, you're the top officer in the Assembly.
Well, when I got those 25 commitments, there were at least a couple of them said, Billy, for 1 year, yes, and not beyond that. And we didn't have a tradition of continuity of leadership at the time, later. So that it was going to be questionable. And the seat was opening up because John Lynch Sr. was mortally ill. Mm-hmm. And I found out the Senate wasn't nearly as much fun as the Assembly, but I thought I should run. And my assemblyman behind me keeps saying, when are you going to announce? When are you going to? If you don't announce, I will. That was David Schwartz. I thought he was pretty cheeky on that, but so I finally announced, and he stayed in the Assembly, and I had almost a primary with John Lynch Jr., but he pulled out and went from there.
Now let's talk about some of the other issues that came up. How about Atlantic City? Where were you? Steve Persky was here this morning, was obviously one of the, if not the key.
He was the key guy, and I was on the other side. We had a newspaper and a newspaper editor who were just death on casino gambling. I thought they were right. I voted against it. I argued a little bit against it. People supported it. People adopted it, approved it second time out.
In retrospect, how do you feel?
Never lived up to the promise, but certainly I think Atlantic City is better off today than it was. We have been pretty successful in keeping the organized crime out, which is one of the issues the governor had. Keep your dirty hands off Atlantic City. That was another good line that he had. But there's still an awful lot to be done in Atlantic City. I don't go there very often, so I don't see it, but that's what I see and hear and understand.
How about the Pinelands, which Brendan Byrne thinks is his most significant accomplishment, even more than the tax package and the school reform program?
I think it was a very good piece of legislation. I think it's solid. I was never that much wrapped up in it, so I can't. But it was a good piece of work.
But it was obvious from your perspective in the legislature that this was something he was going to really fight for.
Yes, and he did. And it didn't come easily, as I recall it. There was a lot of opposition, whether it was development people or otherwise. Home rule people, I'm just not sure. But
and looking back and sort of stepping out of my role as a neutral moderator, even within the staff, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm.
Oh, is that right?
For pushing this, because we didn't see the political advantage, and even the environmental groups, frankly, weren't placing this at the head of their list of priorities.
That's interesting to hear, because the governor certainly.
But this was personally, something that
Do you know why?
had to push.
Do you know why?
Why he pushed?
Yeah.
I think it was his relationship with John McPhee, and he had gone to law school with his brother. And at the end of John McPhee's book on the Pine Barrens, which he called it, he said that although this unique ecological area with the great history it has is so special, politicians are too weak to do anything about it.
Isn't that interesting? That's
And
interesting.
I think Governor Byrne took that as a personal challenge to prove McPhee wrong. But that's a distraction.
Well, next time I see Brendan, I'm going to try to remember to ask him.
And McPhee was a tennis partner of his too.
Well, well, you got to know where the priorities are, right?
Which usually gave you great access to Brendan.
I played tennis with him a couple
Did
times.
you?
Yeah.
How'd you do?
I think we did all right. Well, it was one of those things that Democrats, a day at Morven playing tennis against the governor and the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
He was a much better tennis player than me, though.
How about the sports complex and the Meadowlands development? Again, looking back, good, bad, mixed?
For the most part, good. Again, it was not something that I was all wrapped up in. I was, if you were from Middlesex County, we had to be wrapped up in what was the name on the Giants? Do you remember that?
The Jersey Giants.
The Jersey Giants. But all those things have helped the image of the state. I mean, whatever the problems are in Atlantic City, we're better off with it there. We got two teams playing in the Meadowlands. It's a different state than it was when I ran for the legislature in 1971. We just our perspectives and our feelings about ourselves.
Another Byrne initiative was the creation of New Jersey Transit, restructuring the state's public transit system. Again, success or not?
For the most part, I would say yes. Gambasini was a very fine commissioner, and did a good job selling it. He had a lot of credibility, I think, in the legislature.
And you mentioned the model penal code, and I think jokingly, I think off camera.
Yes.
In fact, tell that story.
Sure. Well, the model penal code had been around for quite a while, and it had not gotten all the way through. It was a progressive piece of legislation. The first day of the 1976 session, the new speaker and the new majority leader, namely Joe LaFonte and I, are going to pay our respects to the governor, as is traditional. We sit and talk, nice little conversation, and the governor says, don't you think it would be neat, I think that was the word he used, if we introduced the penal code, no reference today, that means it wasn't going to committee, and voted on it on Thursday. And I'm saying to myself, what's he smoking? And I looked at Joe, and Joe looked at me, and Joe said, Governor, I don't think we can do that. And it was a heck of a fight after that to get I was in the Senate when it finally passed, and I remember the committee meetings when we were going over Sunday closing and age of consent and all kinds of things that were legitimate areas for people to have different viewpoints on. But he got it through. That was certainly a major, and not an initiative, but a major feature of what Brennan wanted to have happen, and he got it through.
Now, you mentioned that the Senate was less fun for you than the Assembly. Talk about the differences in how the Assembly works and the Senate works and the different cultures in each.
Well, I thought that the Assembly was a very unruly place until I made that 1976 trip to Israel and went in the Knesset and watched the members of the Knesset get up and holler at the presiding officer and at one another and all the rest. We didn't look so bad. We did have Mike Adubato, who was a little bit crazy, although a good person. The Assembly was much more democratic, much less predictable. Senate was a little stodgy. And I had different roles. I was in a leadership 4 out of the 6 years in the Assembly. I ended up as a committee chair in the Senate. I got to serve on the Judiciary Committee. I was the vice chair of institutions and eventually the chair, and enjoyed the work on that committee a great deal. But the Senate just wasn't as much fun. Wasn't as much a part of the action. You weren't making decisions. You weren't making things happen. You weren't strategizing. But good part of my political education anyway.
Who were some of the personalities in the Senate that you remember?
Well, I most fondly I remember my delegation, which was Barney Dwyer and Larry Weiss, who were just two great people. Ferran on the other side. On my committee, besides Tony Scardino and Tony Russo, who were the 2 Democrats, Jim Vreeland and oh golly, I'm going to miss his name, from Bergen County. Gary Hagedorn. 2 really fine gentlemen. I ended up being a conservative on the committee. You had 4 guys there that wouldn't spring for spit if it came to spending any money. But they'd be doing programs that were going to cost a lot of money. And here I am, the guy, I carried the income tax, and I'm the one who's trying to slow them down in terms of the spending. Good people. Ferran, Barry Park was a good guy, Billy Musto, Charlie Yates. I remember when one of my vivid moments in the Senate was in the Abscam. And now you're reading about people in the newspaper, and I guess it was Angelo Ericetti is quoted as saying, "I didn't do anything that 8 or 9 other people, or 6 of them, whatever it was, down there didn't do." And Charlie Yates says, "Name them." And I want to go over and strangle Charlie. Not because I'm afraid of anything, but I know if Angelo gets pushed to name names, I'm sitting on his left-hand side. He's going to name the guy on his left, the guy on his right, the guy in front of him, the guy behind him.
Bill, before we broke, you were talking about the Abscam investigation, and Angelo Ericetti, who was both state senator and mayor of Camden, I believe, at the time.
Yes, he was.
That broke, and your story about being challenged by Charlie Yates.
Yes.
To name names, and you were concerned that he would just turn to you on the left and say, Hamilton did it.
Well, not just me, the one on the left, the one on the right, the people around him, if he had to name names. Didn't happen, and I don't think Angelo's doing well anymore.
Now, as the Byrne administration starts to wind to a close, you decide to become a candidate for governor in the '81 Democratic primary.
Cast of thousands.
Yeah, including Byrne's Attorney General John Degnan and others. What were your sort of political calculations in terms of which counties you needed and who else would be your main opponents and so forth?
Oh, well, I figured that there were half a dozen guys who were major opponents. And I don't know that we had a real sophisticated game plan. I thought that I could trade on the leadership and the results that we'd had in the Assembly when I was in leadership there. And it didn't work. I was not a great fundraiser. I got a lot of good endorsements. I thought a lot of good ideas that other people later borrowed, but just couldn't put it together.
Now, in his interview, John Degnan said he really tried to get you to drop out and support his candidacy. Do you recall discussions, or were they more indirect?
No, I don't remember them, but I will tell you this. There was a time with about 3 weeks to go, well, people were telling me that you're going to get killed. You're not even going to carry Middlesex County, my home county. And I came fairly close to dropping out. And one of the things I'm saying is, if I drop out, am I going to, for a little support I got, am I going to endorse John Degnan, or am I going to endorse Jim Florio? And I remember going home in my living room and talking to the family, and all choked up and said I was. And then I just decided, hey, I've come this far, I'm going to go all the way. I know I'm going to get beat. I'm going to go all the way. And so I did. And don't regret that I did. I wouldn't have made a difference for John. I think he's a marvelous person. I don't think with my support he would have done much better than what he did. I don't think it would have turned things around for Florio. Didn't need to turn anything around.
Well, in fact, Jim Florio does get the nomination.
Right.
And loses that famous election.
1,600 votes.
To Tom Kane. What was your feeling during the general election and during that prolonged recount of the returns?
Well, after the primary, Jim had asked me to be his campaign chairman, and I was not a hands-on chairman, but I was a spokesperson. I was a surrogate speaker for him. I guess he'd pick my brain on some things, and I worked hard. I wanted to see him win. I thought he was his position on taxes. Taxes was back around again, and he was basically said, I don't think we're going to have to do anything with taxes, but if we have to, I'd rather do an income tax than a sales tax. Tom Kane was saying, I won't raise the income tax, and I won't raise the sales tax, and within a year of the time he was elected, did both. And he's a very principled guy, and a guy I think a lot of, but he wasn't as stand-up as Florio, but he did get himself elected, and that's what it's all about.
What were Jim Florio's strengths and weaknesses in that '81 campaign?
Well, his strengths were that he had built a base of support in Bergen. I think he had some in Union. He was a known base because he'd run 4 years earlier. Jim looked cold. I can remember pictures of him in a gray striped suit standing next to an American flag, and there was no warmth to it. And I would hear stories about, well, Florio made 8 stops last night. Kane went to one place and stayed there all night. Well, the people got to see Kane all night, got to touch and feel a real person, and that wasn't true with Jim Florio. I think it was probably a mistake. I thought he'd run a pretty decent campaign. I wasn't in on the polling debriefs as we were going down the search. I remember I had a meeting with him that I won't go into. It was on something that he had in mind for me. 3 weeks out, the thing, we should have been talking about campaign strategy, not talking about making appointments afterwards. Mm-hmm. But I have a high regard and a personal fondness for Jim. I knew Jim going back to Naval Reserve days, as well as a little bit of an association in the Assembly when he was there.
Was there an effort to try to deal with what you called this cold persona in terms of coaching, of saying, could you lighten up a little bit? Or?
Not by me, no. Maybe others didn't see it. I mean,
did you not feel close enough to give him that type of advice?
Well, I wasn't there day to day. If I had to go someplace, I'd be there. I'd be with him a few times, but it wasn't an all day, every day kind of a thing with me. I wasn't asked to be. I would have done more if I was asked. I wasn't asked, and I was content to be doing what I was doing.
And after Tom Kane does get certified as the new governor, how did you sort of view his administration while you're out of elected office at this point?
Well, the thing that I remember saying, I still think it's true. Tom Kane went in and kind of spent like a drunken sailor with the Democrats urging him to spend more. Pretty good governor, pretty good all the way around.
And of course, Alan Karcher now becomes his main foil.
His nemesis, yes.
In the Assembly. How did you sort of view that relationship? Some people think Alan was his own worst enemy by being so aggressive against the administration. How did you take it?
Alan went a little bit overboard. Alan was always an enigma. Alan was my campaign chairman in '81 when I ran. But you never knew what Alan Karcher you were going to get. Was it the liberal Alan Karcher or the conservative? Alan never did vote for our income tax. And yet years later he's there urging it to be more progressive. And so he had kind of a dichotomy with respect to that. But he was a very able politician and had some very fine instincts about public policy.
Now looking back, how have things changed in terms of the balance of power, governor, legislature, courts? Governor as strong as the office used to be, or somewhat weaker, or how do you see it?
Good question. Hadn't thought about it. I don't think this governor, who I supported and will support again, projects as being strong. I don't think Jim McGreevey projected as being strong. I don't think Jim was ready for that. Christy Whitman put a great face on the office and gave the state a good name, but on public policy she was tissue paper thin. I thought that Florio was a very decent governor. I don't think he was particularly well served. Steve Persky, who was very, very able guy, was in his thing, or my successor, John Lynch, as Senate President. I don't think they tempered. They had the votes to do what they wanted to do, and I don't think they tempered it the way they could have. I remember speaking before those votes to both Doyle, whom I'm very close to, and Larry Weiss, who I remain close to. And there was a question, were they just going to address a shortfall in the budget, or were they going to do something beyond that? And I was of the view that they should do both, which is what they did. But they didn't suffer the way we did in getting it done. And I think it helped for the public to see us suffer, that it didn't come easy, that we had to work hard, that it wasn't something that was just given to us. And I think it could have been, as I recall it, the governor had layoff notices. Governor Byrne had governor layoff notices when we were having that $384 million cutback and the rest of it. Some of that could have been structured without being too artificial in the Florio days, and it wasn't. So I guess you look at it, Kane was an effective governor, Byrne was certainly an effective, Hughes was an effective. I don't think the governors today are as strong as they were then. I think institutionally they're probably as strong. I'm not sure personality-wise that they are as strong. But I'm not that close to them.
How about the legislature? You've mentioned, I think, the evolution of the legislature's role. There's certainly many more resources in terms of staff and budget than when you started. Some think that this is maybe counterproductive, that the individual legislators are a little more divorced from the process, that they maybe have too many staff. How do you feel?
Well, I get a sense in a couple of directions, I guess. One is that these leadership packs put an awful lot of clout in the hands of the leaders to do what the leaders decide ought to be done. I'm not sure that's better than us having to get a majority of a majority conference together to support a position, or enough votes out of a majority conference. I don't know that people are overstaffed. And some of the product that comes out, I just don't think the subject matter is... If there's one thing you can say about the 8 Byrne years, one thing you can say about the 10 years that I was down there, which was 2 years before Byrne and the other, there were some lighthouse issues. They were worth breaking your neck trying to get done. And that's not always true. There's still the property tax reform. that nobody seems willing to stick their neck out on. I have a lot of ideas about that we're not going to go into today, but the times and the leadership call for certain things. I think we answered the call. I'm not so sure that everybody answers the call anymore.
What about the role of the court? Could Robinson v. Cahill have decided differently that would have had a more positive long-term impact? We've just recently had the state Supreme Court issue a decision which some have suggested indicates the court retreating from a more activist role in supervising this long-standing tax educational reform program. How do you see it? Were there alternatives the court could have done?
I don't know any that would have been positive. There were some. They could have ducked and let us waffle around and not get anything done. I think, and my view certainly was not a majority view. A lot of people were resentful of what the court did. I think the court used power that, I mean, they had a look to find it, but they found it, they used it, showed some restraint to give time for things to happen, and finally just said, we've had enough. This is what we're going to do. And as I say, that was resented in a lot of circles. I never had any real problem with it. I wasn't happy that it had to be done, but I never had any real problem with it.
In subsequent years, do you think the court got too involved in the details of educational policy?
Probably so. Probably so. I didn't follow it as closely as I did, obviously, when I was involved on a day-to-day basis. But I think so.
What about other decisions like the Mount Laurel affordable housing cases? Was that an area that the court got too much into the turf of the legislature and the government?
I think I'm pleased that they got into it. I'm not so sure that I like everything that happened after they did get into it. But once again, I follow it, but I don't follow it with the close attention that I did when I was, a day-to-day player in the decision making.
As we sort of near the end of these two discussions, I guess what would you like to now change about New Jersey government and politics, or New Jersey in general?
I would like to see a return to the civility that I think we had in my years in the legislature. I understand from everybody that it's missing. I would like to see some of the camaraderie that was there, where people from opposite parties broke bread together, and there was some really good feelings back and forth. It's my understanding that everybody just cuts and runs as soon as the session's over because they got a fundraiser in Trenton or back home. I'd like to see that experiment with public financing get a real good try and see whether that makes any sense. I think the amount of money that's spent in political campaigns is obscene and absurd. It's not a fair test or a statement, because in my first race, the county was giving a whole lot of support, but my running mate and I each race had spent about $900. And I got elected and he missed by 115 votes or something like that. And I'd like to see people willing to stick their neck out and I'd like to see some more bipartisanship. I thought we started to see that. I guess it was part of the Kane administration when Dean Gallo was a leader, and it looked like Republicans were going to abandon their no taxes ever position. That didn't last very long. I'd like to see individual legislators and parties be willing to stick their neck out a little bit more and take some chances. But hey, we still got a good state. We got problems. We're better off than most. And I'm not sorry I was a part of it at one time.
Thank you.